Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me for this on-demand session for the Salt Lake County Watershed Symposium. My name is Taylor Litwin, and I'm the Invasive Weeds Coordinator for the Cottonwood Canyons Foundation. This session today is titled Early Detection, Rapid Response, Mitigating Invasive Weeds in the Tri-Canyons. So first, just a bit of information about the CCF. We're a non-political 501c3 nonprofit, and we partner with the Forest Service to carry out our mission, which is to support the environment of the Cottonwood Canyons through stewardship and education. We have 2 field crews that are out from May to October. The first is our trail crew, who builds and maintains trail systems throughout the Tri-Canyons. And then we also have our invasive weeds crew, which I'll get into detail about throughout this presentation. If you're interested in volunteering with either of us, I'll include a link at the end and you can sign up there. So a big question pertaining to this symposium is, why is invasive weed mitigation important to our watershed specifically? Big and Little Cottonwood Canyon serve as a vital watershed. They provide roughly 60% of our drinking water. So this is a critical resource for both humans and wildlife. And it's important for us to protect our watershed from threats, one of which is the spread of invasive weeds. Invasive weeds can degrade water quality, increase erosion, even pose an increased threat of wildfires. So for us, our goal is to reduce the seed bank of invasive weeds in the soil in order to promote biodiversity, which is key to a healthy forest and a healthy watershed. So in basic terms, what is an invasive weed? This definition has 2 components. It is a non-native plant, and it's a plant that causes harm, whether that's economic, environmental, or harm to human health. Some of the weeds that we track and remove are not yet listed in the Utah state noxious weed list, but they are listed in surrounding states like Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. So we try to get a jump start on those, even if you might not see them listed officially on our state weed list. So why are weeds so successful? They have very resilient and aggressive seed and root systems. So you can see this picture here is of a very obnoxious weed called houndstong. You've probably experienced pulling off a burr from your shoe or your clothes or your dog's fur. This is just an example of the means that invasive weeds will take to hitchhike to a new area and reestablish in the soil. So invasive weeds often produce huge quantities of seeds. For example, Dalmatian toadflax produces up to 500,000 seeds per plant, and they can often remain viable in the soil for years and even decades to come. So even after we remove the surface origin plant, it's possible that decades later, a seed from that same plant will pop up and surprise us. So invasive weeds also have very aggressive root systems. They're sprawling and dense, and they tend to choke out native plants. And as I said, biodiversity is key. The fewer the species, the higher risk there is to being susceptible to like disease and pests and climate change. So we want biodiversity, and invasives make that really difficult. Another term that's important is allelopathic. So some invasives are allelopathic, meaning that they can inhibit surrounding vegetation by altering soil pH. So they can actually just release a chemical that changes the soil nutrients for surrounding plants, making it difficult for them to survive in the same ecosystem. So invasives are incredibly resilient and incredibly relentless, whether it's by means of transportation or growth. This slide here is a screenshot from this book, The Noxious Weed Field Guide for Utah. It's available as a PDF or as a paper copy. We highly recommend it. It's our go-to in the field when we need help with IDing an invasive. The first 2 classifications on this list are the ones we kind of have our eyes out for the most, just because they're either weeds that are not yet in Utah or they are here but in very small amounts. So in this case, for both class 1A and 1B, we want to make sure anything we find within those classes are swiftly eradicated so that they don't become an issue in the future. We do monitor and remove all classes as needed, and if they're in aggressive infestations. So there's 4 steps of invasive weed mitigation. The first is prevention. So basically stopping the weeds before they have a chance to spread. This can include just simply educating the public and educating private landowners to the sort of the method of transportation of weeds and stopping those seeds physically from relocating to new areas. So this could include installing tools like boot brushes at trailheads so that recreators have a chance to clean their boots before they begin hiking. We often see invasive weeds within the first quarter mile of a trail. So that does mean that humans are contributing to the spread of these weeds, and we do have the opportunity to slow the spread if we are educating each other about the issue at hand. So step 2 would be detection. This really refers to our monitoring process for weeds. So we keep really diligent data. When we find a population of weeds, we map it right in our GIS system. So the 2 maps here are not part of our GIS database, but they are screenshots from that noxious weed field guide I wanted to include. It really just shows the sort of the visual impact of mapping. The left-hand side, we have the range of Dalmatian toadflax within the state of Utah. You can see it's almost in every county. And then on the right, we have purple star thistle, which is another invasive that hasn't quite taken root as much, but it is in Salt Lake County. So you can see the contrast here. It's important for us to be able to visualize where these weeds are coming in from, where we can stop them at the source, etc. So these next 2 steps are the most hands-on and sort of the steps that are the most, that need the most hands on deck. So step 3 is control and management, which literally just means removing all of the weeds we can find by the best means possible. We have 3 methods of control that we could tap into. We really use mechanical control the most because it's actually the simplest. It's just hand pulling or tilling the soil. And then another method of control is called biocontrol, which is when another species that is a natural predator to an invasive weed is introduced to an environment to be used as a method of control. So I'll provide an example of that in a future slide, but this could be an insect, fungus, or even like a small mammal. The third method of control is chemical control, which is the use of herbicide, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Step 4 is the most fun. This is restoration and rehabilitation, and this basically means planting. So we collect seeds at the end of the season of native wildflowers. You can see this photo on the right is just a collection of species we were gathering for seed collection at the end of the season, and we send them over to our partner at Dryland Horticulture, and he grows them over the winter for us and returns them to us in these pallets of wildflower starts that you can see on the left. That's a pallet of showy milkweed that we distributed within the 3 canyons in 2021. So restoration is important. Invasive weeds love disturbed soil, so anytime there's a new parking lot, trail, bathroom installed in any of the canyons, weeds love to take over that loose, disturbed soil. So we are trying to take areas that are disturbed and get wildflowers in the ground that are native so that we sort of promote biodiversity before invasives can monopolize the area. Like I said, herbicide usage in the canyons is a method of control, but it's used very sparingly and strategically because we realize we're working mainly within a watershed. And so it's a priority for us to avoid getting any chemicals into our water supply. And with that, we mainly will spray small populations in Mill Creek or areas that don't have a risk of runoff, like that aren't high in elevation or slope. So it's important to note that only licensed applicators can apply herbicide. If you come across a population that you believe could use herbicide application, you can reach out to us at the CCF or Salt Lake Public Utilities or the Utah Conservation Corps. We are all licensed applicators. And as a final note with herbicide, it can be a detrimental tool to our watershed, or it could be helpful, but it all depends on the strategy and the approach. So we are very cautious with this. You can see on the picture on the right here, we found a leafy spurge population on Pipeline in Mill Creek. And this is an example. It was a field, a fairly flat field that could use herbicide to keep it under control. So that single plant standing there was not sprayed with herbicide, and the rest of it was. And that was only a matter of 3 days time. So it did start to kill off this population, which is hopeful. So this contrast here is a mitigation site between Wildcat and the Peruvian. You can see this picture on the left is covered with yellow sweet clover, which is an invasive weed that is toxic to deer and livestock. So we saw this site here, and I figured it was a good example of showing you all 4 of these mitigation steps sort of at work. We mapped this site. Alta and ourselves have been monitoring this site for years, and we got to work hand pulling all this sweet clover that had grown throughout the 2021 season. We filled, I think, 9 55-gallon bags of these weeds. So that's like maybe 200 pounds. And the result is the right picture here, where we have sage and rabbit brush that are kind of reestablishing in the soil. And hopefully we will get there next year and plant some native wildflowers to really secure that biodiversity before any invasives come and take over that loose soil, which they love to do. So as a list of just high priority species that we control in these canyons, we have this list here with asterisks on a few of them. And as I mentioned, a few of these are not on our Utah state list yet, but do exist in Colorado, Montana, and we're already seeing their impacts here in Utah. So I'll just, for the sake of time, talk through 5 of the highest priority species that we work with. The first being Canada thistle. So thistle is a very difficult plant family to sort of identify and remove. You can see it has those thorns running up the stem, and we often need to layer up our gloves when we're removing thistle. There's actually 7 species of thistle in Utah, 5 of which are invasive. The native species are Utah thistle and Eaton's thistle, which is found at high alpine environments. So Canada thistle is definitely invasive. You can find fields of it up in the canyons, and we're doing our best to remove it in the masses. And the best approach to actually mitigate this weed is just to prevent its spread in the first place. So it's a plant that really likes to reproduce by its roots rather than its seeds, and it can extend these horizontal roots laterally under the soil for like over 15 feet. So if you think of a single origin plant 15 feet across a field, it could shoot up another plant for us to remove. So it's definitely a tough one to deal with, but it's easy to ID that the family of thistle, because most of them have this purple or pink flower at the top and the thorny stems. Myrtle Spurge is this succulent looking plant. It actually started off as an ornamental, and it's escaped high up into the canyons, as I've seen it as high up as like Box Elder picnic area in Mill Creek. It's terribly, it's toxic, so it's just an awful plant to deal with, especially on your own and without the use of herbicide. So we put this warning here. It does have caustic latex sap on all parts of the plant, the leaves, the stems, the roots. It's extremely drought tolerant, so it's really just kind of taking over these vast spreading slopes in all the canyons lower down towards the mouth. You can look down from Pipeline and just see this bluish green coverage, just like a ground cover at this point, and that's all Myrtle Spurge. So proper protection should definitely be worn if you're dealing with Myrtle Spurge. It's no longer legal to sell at nurseries or greenhouses, so you shouldn't see it on the market anymore. And now our goal is to just reduce its numbers year after year. Common or flannel mullein, this is also known as lamb's ear. You can see that rosette picture in the top right is that's its early stages, when it's actually most important to remove it, because the bottom picture here has over 240,000 seeds, and it's flowering, and it's close to dropping those seeds into the soil where they can remain viable for over 100 years. So mullein is an important plant to tackle. I've seen mullein in the canyons that are 6 feet, 7 feet tall somehow. So it's definitely a plant that it's sturdy and it's hardy, so it does have the capacity to grow back from just a broken stem at the bottom. It's really important to get that root system out of the soil and repeat that process until the numbers drop down. Dalmatian toadflax is an example of that biocontrol I mentioned. In this case, a stem-boring weevil was introduced to the canyons, and actually in Salt Lake Valley, so it has now creeped its way up the canyons. This weevil is just a tiny beetle. You can see here in the top right, it has nestled its way into the leaves of this toadflax. And these weevils are like thousands of volunteers that just eat this plant from the inside out. They do our job for us if it's the right conditions. We've seen toadflax up at Alta that does not have weevils yet, so we're thinking maybe they're not adapted to that high of elevation. So if we see a Dalmatian toadflax plant without a weevil, we definitely remove it. Otherwise, this plant can produce 500,000 seeds. All of these plants produce just a tremendous amount of seeds, which makes it difficult to contain, and that's why we try to be so diligent about mapping so we know where these seed banks exist in the soil. And it's important to try to detect and mitigate as early as possible with Dalmatian toadflax. We just mitigated a population at Brighton. There's a few sprinkled into like the private homes at Brighton. So definitely private landowners should also be aware of these species on their property, and it will help the watershed in general if we're all aware of them and take our own steps to mitigate. So last but not least is Oxide Daisy. It's actually a beautiful flower, but it's terribly invasive and harmful to surrounding vegetation. It's often used as like a backdrop for wedding photography. So we suggest removing this plant and replacing it with native wildflowers of similar colors. So we have a bunch of whites and yellows of native wildflowers that we planted to supplement Oxide Daisy being removed. This is also an ornamental that kind of got out of hand since the 1800s. And its root system is pretty shallow, so it can be taken care of by just repetitive cultivation and tilling. That might actually be the best approach because it does kind of sprawl at the surface. The lower picture there shows its rosette stage, so pretty early in its life cycle. So yeah, we definitely recommend any of these invasives that look beautiful. We agree, but they're also terribly detrimental to other beautiful native wildflowers. So we're trying to kind of supplement as in as many areas as we can. So in closing, I just wanted to include sort of this list of stats from our 2021 Weeds Crew season. We were able to accomplish a lot with the help of our sponsors and partners. We removed over 3.2 tons of weeds from the Tri-Canyons. We scouted over 120 miles of trail. We established 6 new restoration sites. So that's areas where we've planted those native wildflower starts, and we'll check on them again next year and make sure they're doing well in that soil and elevation. And we also completed 5 successful rare plant surveys throughout the canyons. If you have any questions about these numbers, feel free to reach out. There's a lot of information here, but we were able to accomplish a lot. And especially since COVID, it's been great to get out in the field and build up this capacity again with this crew. So thank you again to all our sponsors listed here. And here's my email if you have any questions about this presentation. If you have any interest in volunteering with us, I attached a link here. So thanks all for coming, and I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentations at the symposium. Thanks so much.